Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this music, and we think we won't get sued because it came from a site where they said that was free music. I don't know what's going on. It's the theremin music to make ghostly sounds, and we're doing ghostly sounds this week because we're talking about the Fontana book of great ghost stories. It's a series of books that the great Robert Aickman edited during the 60s and 70s, I want to say, 60s and 70s for Fontana. He was an agent, a literary agent, and a pretty smart guy, and he liked to read a lot too. So he picked a lot of these stories, and there's I think there's 8 of these that Robert Aickman selected himself. I think the series went on after he quit doing them, and I have most of the Aickman ones, most of which have an introduction by Aickman at the beginning, and are are kind of classics, well-known classic compilations of ghost stories. And we have to use the word ghost stories with quotes around them because they're usually not exactly ghost stories, just like most of what Robert Aickman wrote weren't really ghost stories or horror stories. So that's a long way of getting there. I wanted to say that this is we've been on the cusp. We've been on this cusp, this eternal cusp of hitting 2,000 subscribers. So I kept thinking all week we were going to do our big slam bang spectacular 2,000th episode, and I just realized today it's probably a few more days, and then I've got to do all the production. It's going to be a huge production thing. Got the production crews coming up, and we got to have guest stars and all this stuff. It's going to be a big deal here at the bathtub. So I decided to do this one very quickly, and it's just as bad as normal. This is just as disorganized as most of our talks. This I just finished this past week, and I read it. I read like a story a day. I'd heard that these were good collections for years. I don't know hardly anything about ghost stories. I haven't really read many ghost stories, and as I've talked a lot in the past couple of years, I've only just started getting into either contemporary horror fiction or classic horror fiction. I only just started reading Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith is new to me. So I thought this would be a good way of reading some of these old classics and a lot of the greats. There's this is a really good book. So that's all I would say. They're very. What's interesting, he's a good anthologist, Aickman. He knows not to just do the same thing. There's only 2 or 3 stories in here that are what I consider ghost stories. We actually have ghosts, and those are kind of the least memorable stories. I mean, there's a story in here by Mrs. Gaskell called The Old Nurse's Story. But most of the stuff in here, there's a story by Sheridan Le Fanu, who's actually, I have read a bit of him. He writes some pretty interesting Gothic literature, Gothic horror fiction. And a story of his called Squire Toby's Will. That's a little bit more of a ghost story. But most of the stuff is very unusual and very different. So I'm just looking through it now, and I forgot most of these stories already. There's a story at the beginning by L.P. Hartley, a writer I've never been wild about, and it's probably my least favorite story in the book. It leads off the collection. But then it has stories such as D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winner. Most of you know D.H. Lawrence's great short story about the kid there's a bit of, as in a lot of Lawrence, there's a lot of kind of sexual metaphor in it. It's about a young kid who grows up riding this rocking horse in his room, and he has a gift for hearing who's going to win the latest horse race, who's going to win the horse race. And his parents are constantly broke, and it's about him trying to always win these horse races for his parents, so they'll stop fighting. Basically, they're constantly fighting about money. It's a really powerful story. It's a wonderful story. Again, there's no real ghost in it. What else is in it? There's a good introduction. I'm not as wild. There's a really fascinating little story by a guy named, never heard of these people, Richard Middleton, called The Ghost Ship, which is actually quite a funny story. I'm just going to give you the setups for these stories, which is that there's a town, some sort of, I think somewhere somewhere on the coast, some coast town in England, where the ghosts just run freely. There's ghosts all over this town. And people are used to having ghosts just living as part of their lives. And eventually, at one point at the beginning of this story, a large ghost ship comes in off the ocean filled with ghosts. And they kind of take over this town and they start mixing with the ghosts that are in the town. It's a really unusual, fun little story. Very different. And it's not really horror so much as kind of a comic story. There's William Hope Hodgson, The Voice in the Night. That's one of the most kind of scary stories in the whole book. William Hope Hodgson I think he was a seaman, and he wrote some horror novels. Sorry when I said seaman, didn't mean to upset anybody, but he was a seafaring lad, and he eventually wrote a lot of horror novels. I had read, he's famous for writing a book called The House on the Borderland, and another one called The Night something. I forget now. But The House on the Borderland is one of those kind of classic horror fictions that I've read and found it really boring. But this story, The Voice of the Night, is really good. It's about this couple that gets lost at sea and what happens to them. It's a very dark and frightening story. There's the great Algernon Blackwood. One of H.P. Lovecraft's most favorite stories is Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo. It's a good long story. Really, really atmospheric, really strange. Not ghosts. It's kind of otherworldly creatures coming into our world. The Crown Derby Plate by Marjorie Bowen. That's kind of a standard ghost story. It's sort of a standard ghost story. A woman goes to a house, and I won't tell you any more than that. The best stories in the book, not surprisingly, are by Robert Aickman himself and his girlfriend when he was young, or a partner of his when he was young. Her name was Elizabeth Jane Howard, and the two of them, Aickman and Elizabeth Jane Howard, published a book, and I should have written this down, but I didn't, called We Are the Dark, I believe. And it was basically 6 strange stories. Aickman wrote 3 of them, and Elizabeth Jane Howard wrote 3 of them. That's probably a big collector's item now. And in that collection, there was Robert Aickman's, one of his all-time great stories called The Trains. I think we talked about The Trains. Again, there's no ghost in it that I recall, but there are ghostly images throughout it. And it's one of the most haunting. I still remember this story quite vividly, especially them walking across Yorkshire and seeing these trains going by overhead with the people in the trains looking ahead of them with this kind of rapt expression on nothingness. And it's a really brilliant story. It will surprise you all the way through. And I had never read Elizabeth Jane Howard before, but this includes a story of hers called 3 Miles Up. And it's one of the best stories in the book. It's, again, not a ghost story so much as a diversion from reality. And it's about this couple of guys who are off on a boat going on with these trips, traveling through these little rivers of England and going up the locks. And they take a diversion up some really rough part of some rough area that they've never been through before. And I don't want to tell you any more. It's just a really, really haunting, interesting story. And it closes, the last story in the book is by a guy named Walter de la Mare, who I have never read before. I've heard great things about him. Seaton's Aunt. And it's a beautifully written sort of vampire story. And I can't even really, I won't tell you any more than that, because these are all kind of surprising stories. Lovely, really, really good writer, and I want to read more Walter de la Mare. So really kind of a great way to kind of introduce yourself to great kind of classic ghost stories. As far as Aickman's concerned, he says there's only a few dozen great strange stories in the English language, and he tries to put them into all of these. I think 8 volumes altogether. I'm going to read the whole series, and we'll probably talk about them. I'm going to eventually go to the second and third volumes, which I have. They're hard to get. And I will say they're hard to get in good condition. I mean, this is the filthiest book I've ever read. I don't like to read books that are covered with water stains. This was the only copy I could get, and I'm glad I did. But it's kind of it's a miserable, beat-up old copy. Okay, so also I wanted to do cheers. So next time I see you, we'll be doing the spectacular 2,000 subscribers. I want to do a brief bit of New-Bop-a-Lula because we have some really interesting books that came in that I'm not going to be able to write about. One is a new translation of The Little Man from Archangel. Penguin has stopped. They've actually translated all the Maigres. So they're actually going back and doing some of the important thrillers. This is one of the better ones. I can't remember it, but I do remember thinking this was one of the strong ones. And they're going back and doing new translations of some of these important thrillers. So these are the roman d'heure, the hard novels. Some people call them the thrillers versus the Maigres. And this has just come out. If you're a big Simenon fan, I always think you're better starting with the thrillers. So you might want to try this one. Second of all, another thing from Penguin is Chester Himes's A Rage in Harlem has come out in a lovely new edition. Chester Himes wrote something called the Harlem Cycle with Gravedigger Jones. Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson are the two kind of the black cops in Harlem in this really rough part of town. I love these books, and we're definitely going to do Himes, and Himes is going to be in the All Bathtub Hall of Fame eventually when I get a chance to read some of these. And this is this is the first in a series, A Rage in Harlem. The detectives, Coffin Ed and Gravedigger Jones, kind of come into the middle of it. It's just continuous chaos, and it's just this kind of nightmarish Hieronymus Bosch-like atmosphere and landscape where everyone's cheating everybody else, everyone's a crook, and it's very funny, beautifully written books, and they're a little up and down, they're a little uneven as far as the series, but the whole series is worth reading. So this is definitely, read the first one. He didn't really intend to write a series of detective novels, but he kind of fell into it, and this is the book where he falls into it, and one of the best crime novels I've ever read. Finally, when we got crime, I'm going to put you a link to my Bugsy Siegel review. I reviewed this for The Spectator. This is a small 200-page biography of the kind of fascinating gangster Bugsy Siegel, who designed and created the Flamingo Hotel. And there's a great Warren Beatty movie. I'm not a big Warren Beatty fan, but I love the movie that Beatty did about Bugsy Siegel. And this is actually a good little 200-page biography. I like short biographies. And it's published in the Jewish Lives series that comes out of Yale. I'll put a little link to it below. Okay, I just want to do this really quick because I didn't want to, miss we're kind of got a breakneck pace with these shows, and if there are people out there who, who get their family together every week to watch this, and I didn't want to disappoint them. There's your episode until the next one, and the next one will be the 2000th subscriber episode. Hold on to your hats. It's going to be a wild ride, the 2000th subscriber episode. See you soon.